Go Local Live, I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. John Giorgi, I think, gave today a 9, so we've got a whole week of great weather here in southern New England. If you haven't seen the news overnight, Go Local was on the scene last night with a tragic gangland shooting over on Carolina Ave in Providence. The biggest shooting in the city's history. 9 people were injured, and there's much more news. But let's go to something cutting edge, technology driven. Professor Otto Gregory at the School of Engineering down at University of Rhode Island is doing some remarkable work. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Josh. How are you?
I'm great. Listen, people don't know this about me, but I am a nanotechnology microsensor junkie. When we saw the announcement about your technology come through the transom, I said, we've got to get this guy on Go Local Live. Let's talk about, you're developing a digital dog nose. Walk us through that technology.
So a digital dog nose is a type of what might be referred to as an electronic nose. And our digital dog nose sensors work essentially by having a catalyst that interacts with something, a threat in most cases, and that threat molecule is decomposed in the presence of the catalyst, and we just simply measure the energy of decomposition. And because the molecules we're looking at typically have a lot of stored energy, we can get a signal from the energy released due to decomposition. In a sense, that's the entire sensing approach using the digital dog nose. So we have a reference sensor that can essentially subtract out any what I call hydrodynamic effects or sensible heating effects. Those are effects that, air is blowing across the sensor, takes into account things like humidity and airflow and temperature variations that might be different locally. That is right where the sensor is. And so the reference sort of subtracts out other issues. So the signal that we get is purely due to the catalytic interaction or the catalyst interacting with the threat molecules. And we measure that as a heat effect. And the way we do that is our reference and our catalyst-coated sensor is maintained at the same temperature. And if they vary in temperature, there's going to be a power requirement to either heat up or cool down the catalyst-coated sensor relative to the reference, and that measurable power difference to maintain them at the same temperature is what we're measuring. And
okay, so let's talk about application. Your
Okay.
technology is a microsensor that de facto works like a dog's nose. Those dogs that are outside a stadium trying to detect terrorist threats, or at the airport trying to detect drugs. And literally, you can take this microsensor technology, apply it to a drone, fly it over maybe potentially a minefield, a stadium, and be able to detect threats, whether it's an ammunition or some other type of compound that potentially detects that there is a terrorist threat. Am I correct?
That is correct. So our sensors are extremely lightweight. So one of the issues with putting sensors on drones for this purpose is drone payloads are extremely small. And so our sensor, the active part of our sensor, weighs micrograms. That's a very small fraction of a gram. And so these are very lightweight sensors that can go on a drone platform and not add weight to the payload, if you will. So they're ideally suited for going into areas where you don't want humans to be at risk. You put them on a drone and the drone can go and sniff out something. That's the basic idea behind this technology.
Listen, we're going to post your video along with this interview, but what it shows is the ability to fly over space. And listen, we know globally there are minefields throughout the world that are still live and harming, killing innocent people all the time. Instead of this having to be done by handwork or by ground level detection devices, this potentially, your technology could be put on a drone, it could fly over, identify where potentially mines are located, correct?
That's correct. And that's really, there's a lot of interest in our technology because we were sniffing out, if you will, the explosives that were used by terrorists. Namely, if you looked at all the terrorist events around the world in the last 4 or 5 years, they used a material called triacetylene triperoxide, or TATP, either as the initiator for the explosive or as the energetic material itself. And so if you have roadside IEDs and they've used TATP as the initiator, we should be able to detect it.
Okay, now how detailed, how fine can this microsensor work? Let me give you another example. Could we potentially use them to detect, in the case of people carrying a coronavirus, Ebola? Could you fly over a soccer field and identify those who have Ebola?
It's a great question. We do not, it is not a biological sensor. It is a chemical sensor. So we can detect biomarkers if they're a chemical compound, but we cannot tell, we cannot tell directly viruses or bacteria or other biological entities. We are a chemical sensor. And so if there's a biomarker, and that's what we think dogs can do relative to COVID, is that dogs are picking up a specific biomarker and alerting people that they may have COVID. There's a lot of groups working around the world right now on dogs being able to sniff out COVID in certain people that are going into a venue. I think CNN did something on COVID sniffing dogs at Miami Heat games.
Yeah, that's right. If you pass through the dogs, I think you could sit courtside. I think was that was a good motivation to make sure that you'd got vaccinated.
Right.
So maybe we can use that down at the Ryan Center. If you can get vaccinated, you pass through your drone and there's no identification, you can sit there right next to Coach Cox. Let's talk about this. If it's chemical, the number of applications are, I don't want to say limitless, but far beyond that as well. All sorts of types of applications, whether it's pollutants for brownfields or all sorts of different ways of detecting issues, correct?
That is correct. It's not just, so we got started and funded originally to do explosives because they were the target materials that were hard to detect, okay? And so that's where we got our start. But we have been looking at biomarkers more recently for diseases. We have looked at things that let me just say, things that you wouldn't normally consider. For example, one of the applications is for wounds, okay? And we've considered this when somebody is on a battlefield and gets wounded with shrapnel or whatever, and they have an open wound, one of the biological responses is the generation of hydrogen peroxide in the vicinity of the wound. And if you could monitor that hydrogen peroxide, for example, with some kind of wearable sensor, you could then have some feedback, if you will, to see if that wounded person is being compromised, is having the right amount of antibiotic or whatever. And so there's certain kinds of applications that are biological in a sense, but it's chemical detection. That's what I want to emphasize. It's not biological detection. So,
Professor, You started this exact exercise 15 years ago and have received support from DARPA, which is probably one of the least known but most interesting aspect of our federal government. Talk a little bit about the genesis 15 years ago and the role DARPA played in funding these projects.
So DARPA is, people remember the Reagan administration. DARPA really got a lot of traction in the Reagan administration. These are projects that were viewed as long-term and somewhat high risk but high reward. So if you can imagine, an idea, a concept put forth, and somebody wanting and willing to take a chance on it and fund it, it could have real long-term implications. And so this project started as a DARPA-funded project, mainly to look at toxic gases. Okay, that is threats that would be used in gas warfare. When I say gases, chemical weapons and the such. And so we started to look at that, and after our first 2 years of funding from DARPA, it was funded by the Army for the same reason. And then, 9/11 happened, and everybody's sort of focus shifted to what's going on in the world of terrorism. And so from that point on, we were funded by Homeland Security to look at threats from the viewpoint of IEDs and other kinds of threats that could be put on airplanes, put in public transportation venues, subways, trains, all those venues that were targets. Can you sniff out threats in those venues for these potential really deadly explosives that some of them can be made really easily by going to the local drugstore or hardware store, and you have some very nasty material. I'll just say that.
So in computing, the old rule, which I think finally is no longer the rule, but Moore's law was that computing got faster and smaller every year by some significant degree. And then I think they figured out Moore's law didn't carry forever. Is microsensing, the devices you're developing, kind of have the same truism? Do microsensors get smaller and more effective, more vibrant in being able to detect things as time goes by? Is that technology progressing?
So the answer is yes, in general, especially if you're talking about MEMS-based sensors, which are very small, micro-machined elements that can be integrated with electronics on the same substrate. And so that is definitely driven by size. But in our case, because of the way we detect, power, electrical power was the thing that we were most concerned with. And so that required us to shrink the mass of our sensor. So when we started out, our sensors were on the order of grams, and systematically we've been reducing the weight, and now we have sensors that weigh literally micrograms, and that's a millionth of a gram, and consequently the sensitivity, the responsiveness, the response time, and the power requirements have dropped dramatically by decreasing what I call the thermal mass of our sensor. And that's really the key where we got to today, is the fact that we didn't necessarily shrink the footprint, although it did get very small. But what we were able to shrink is the mass of the sensor, and that's what the difference is. So in a sense, it's the same thing that you would do with MEMS, shrinking the size, but there's one fundamental difference, Josh, and that is that we rely on a catalytic response. And so as you know, catalysts depend on surface area. So we can't shrink the footprint because we need a critical amount of surface area for our catalyst. So we're somewhat more limited than you would be with a MEMS sensor, where you can shrink it to, sub-micron levels easily, but we need some surface area for our catalyst. So weight was more important than area.
Than size. Yeah, right. So when will we see Homeland Security or the National Guard or the United States Army deploying this type of technology at Penn Station or Gillette Stadium or an abandoned minefield in Uganda?
So for the stadium venue, the drone application is one approach. We also make fixed versions. A fixed. When I say a fixed version, that is, you walk through some kind of portal that as you walk by,
like a metal detector.
Like a metal detector,
right?
And you can be sniffed that way. Everything is totally passive. You would not know that you're being sniffed. I mean, when a dog comes up to you and sniffs you, but our sensors are completely passive, so you would not know that you're being sniffed, if you will. And so it's non-invasive. It's less invasive than a dog coming up to you and sniffing your clothing or your hands or whatever. So.
And will we see an outrage? Will dogs be picketing the University of Rhode Island because of potential loss of their positions in these key national defense and policing organizations?
Certainly not in the short term. Dogs are the gold standard. They have great capability and great sensitivity, but there's several issues with dogs. I've mentioned before that dogs have a short attention span, relatively speaking, hour and a half, 2 hours. They need a break, and so that's sorry about that. So that's one thing. The other thing is dogs need training and retraining, and that's expensive and time consuming. And they're based on a reward system. Their response to things are based on rewards. So there's a lot of maintenance and cost involved in having dogs sniffing venues for bombs and other threats.
Dogs are exactly like journalists. Give me another story. I'll come back again. I only have attention span of 2 hours. It's very, very, very similar. Professor, remarkable work, and this is cutting edge work. I do know the space. This is at a national and global level. What does it mean for the university, and where do you take it next?
So that's a great question. So we are still doing research to push the technology. I'll say that, but more importantly, to look at different applications, because every application is very specific to a given molecule or type of molecule, and so we have to tweak our catalyst to target that threat. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is we are doing arrays of sensors. So dogs have many more times the sensors in their nose for detecting compounds than human beings, when millions more sensors in their nose than human beings have. So that's how they can be so sensitive. So when we have an electronic nose, like the digital dog nose, we need to make sensor arrays to specifically identify threats that may have interference. When I say an interferent, that is something that is not our target, but we need to know about, okay? And so identification sort of requires us to have arrays of these microsensors instead of just one or two sensors. And so that's what we're working on now, our sensor arrays. And the other thing we're working on is, as I said before, is different threats. That is, whether they be mines or explosives or other threats to the military or military personnel, or wounds, or COVID. It's got to be tweaked using our catalyst. So that's what we're working on, and we're still being funded. One of the current things we're doing is working with the Coast Guard, because one of the things we have been looking at are illicit drugs. Okay, so the Coast Guard is very interested in that aspect. So dogs are used, obviously drug sniffing dogs are used, but there are certain applications and certain venues for the Coast Guard where it's just not possible to bring a dog into a situation. And for those situations, our wearable sensor might be a solution for the Coast Guard. And that's one of the things we're working on. So it's broad-based and has lots of applications out there, but we really want to get this into the end user's hands. We want to get this into
commercialized
the hands of people who actually will benefit from this. That's really where we're going, Josh.
Now listen, this is tremendously interesting. We look forward to hearing about updates throughout. I want to thank you on short notice for taking the time to join us. We'll be sure to embed the video, because I think that's remarkable about it. And I do think you have one significant advantage with your digital dog nose over the existing so-called technology. I'm not sure you're as distracted by bacon as much as those traditional technology are, but we'll see in the long term. We'll have to do some level of testing about that. Professor, thank you so much. For everybody else, stay tuned. We've got a lot of updates today on GoLocal. There are a number of issues breaking even on this beautiful Friday. We'll stay tuned on that. Stay tuned for more updates on GoLocal. And also, everybody, please get vaccinated. Obviously, it's critical to our economic recovery and to people's good health. Wear your mask where appropriate, but please, if you haven't gotten vaccinated, take the time. It's easy. Tomorrow's my 14th day. I'm a free man after my 2 shots of Pfizer. I encourage everybody to take the time to do it. It is a remarkably good feeling once you are fully vaccinated. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.